Good morning, everyone, online and in the room. Thank you for coming this morning or joining us online this morning. My name is Josh Boots, Executive Director of Empower K-12, and this morning we are talking about an update on unfinished learning from 2020-2021 school year. We did a report last December looking at data from last fall. This is an update of that report using data from spring that was provided to us by DC Public Schools and DC Public Charter Schools throughout the district. Some of the key findings from our data about unfinished learning from 2021. What we noticed is that most students significantly fell behind where they would typically be compared to pre-pandemic. That was particularly evident for students who are at risk, or students who are students with disabilities, or Black and Latinx learners. We also noticed that academic growth rates throughout the school year were flatter than the typical growth rates pre-pandemic. We also found that more time spent in-person learning last year did translate to some higher growth data throughout the school year. First, let's look at our youngest learners. These students took assessments, leveled learning assessments like DIBELS, TRC, Fontes, and Pinnell. These are assessments where they read to their teacher and their teacher scores them. And what we find are that fewer students are reading on grade level, but we do find that students who are designated as at risk were falling further behind their not at risk peers. We saw an 18 percentage point drop in the percent of students who were on grade level across all of our sample students. And then we saw a 27 point drop for students designated as at risk. In grades 2 through 8, these students took computerized assessments called NWA MAP or iReady. These are adaptive assessments that look at where they score in the fall and compare it to where they score in the spring. And what we find are that from spring 2019 to spring 2021, we looked at students who had taken the same assessment in both spring of 2019 and spring of 2021 and found significant declines in the achievement of those students. For those students, their percentile point rank dropped 9 points overall. But for students who were designated as at risk, it was a 14 point drop. For those who were not at risk, that was a 5 point drop in reading. And similarly in math, similar sorts of declines. Overall, a 10 point percentile point drop for students in grades 2 through 8, but for students who are designated as at risk, 13 point drop. For those who are not at risk, an 8 point drop. Let's look at academic growth throughout the year. These assessments really track, where you're supposed to be from fall to winter to spring. And what we found is generally the students were flat in terms of their growth compared to pre-pandemic. So we see that growth rates from fall to winter to spring of reading were typically much flatter than normal. In math, it was sort of flat from fall to winter, but we do see, particularly for middle school math, winter to spring growth was almost normal. Students in grades 3 through 8 we also looked at what percent of growth are they supposed to meet. So when they take the assessment in the fall, they do get a spring target. So if their spring target was 10 points and they met 9 of those 10 points, we would say that they met 90% of their growth target. What we did find is that students were only typically making 40 to 50% of their growth target from fall to winter. And what we find is that, again, there is going to be differences between those who are students who are designated as at risk and those who are not. So larger drops for those who are designated as at risk in terms of a little bit more unfinished learning for them compared to those who are not at risk. Same thing for students with disabilities and for our English learners. We did bring some students back throughout the year, which was very important hard work, and I thank all of our teachers and educators and principals for doing that work. What we did find is that likely translated to to higher growth rates for some of our students. For students who were fully remote the full year, we saw that across all of our sample students, they met 47% of their growth target. For those who returned sometime during the fourth quarter, that was 57% of their growth target. And for those who returned at some point in the third quarter or earlier, they met 66% of their growth target in math and reading. For students who are designated at risk, pre-pandemic at the schools that we got data from, they were achieving 105% of their growth target, meaning if it was a 10-point gain that they were supposed to make, they were getting 10.5 points, or an extra half month of growth each year, which is great. But what we find this year is that there were only a handful of schools that were able to meet that average. Most schools were far below that average. Some of those schools are here today. But I would like to specifically point out Friendship Online, Barnard, Cleveland, McKinley Middle School, Czech, Savoy, Dorothy Height, Friendship Chamberlain, and Perry Street Prep for getting nearly the same amount of growth for students designated as at risk as pre-pandemic. We talked to a few of those school leaders already. DC Policy Center is talking to all of those school leaders, and we'll publish a report on that. But here are some of the things that we've heard so far from those school leaders that were able to get tremendous growth from their students designated as at risk last year. What we noticed is that they spent a lot of time addressing that social, emotional, and physical well-being. That they provided additional resources from the counselors to get as many virtual, and I think Patricia will talk about this a lot. They also adopted a whatever it takes attitude to get stuff to their students and to bring them back into the classroom. We noted that Friendship had taken our fall student well-being survey and had seen that a lot of students were not getting enough food. So they sent extra food home just to meet those physical well-being needs so that the students would be ready to learn at home. They also used the new data sources that were available to them, the well-being surveys, the engagement data from their online blended learning systems. And they still continue to have high expectations of students. One of the schools in here still sent every one of their students designated at a risk into accelerated math and taught them accelerated math throughout the year. In addition to all of the data that we have shared so far about unfinished learning, we are in the middle of another student well-being survey and educator well-being survey. So these are early release data points from our fall survey this year. The survey window is still open, so when we publish a final report, these numbers might be slightly different. But what we find is that educators are finding some degree of challenge of implementing COVID protocols in their school, but at least they're finding that they are getting clear expectations from their school leadership about what those guidelines should be. What we did notice and find interesting findings is that they do feel like they are not necessarily fully well equipped to deal with the stress and trauma that students are experiencing right now. They are also indicating that they themselves are struggling with dealing with their own self-care as a teacher. We asked teachers who had been at the same school for 2 or more years, what is it like now compared to pre-pandemic? What they told us is that they're spending more time on social emotional well-being of their students, addressing behavioral challenges. They're spending a little bit more time on building out their daily lesson plans, but they're also spending more time engaging with their families, which is good. They're also very concerned about their peers right now. We asked students, and what we noticed so far is that almost 4 in 10 students have had to quarantine at least once because they themselves have tested positive for COVID or somebody near them. But what we are finding is that most of them say that they are coming back ready to learn and pick up the lessons right away. We also asked students about tutoring. 1 in 4 students have indicated that they have a tutor so far and that it is working for them. And for those that don't, nearly half said a tutor would be helpful for them. So ultimately, where does this lead? It leads to what we believe is our call to action. And what we think is that we need bold approaches. We need bold goals for our students. I'm just gonna say it, the start of this decade sucked. It sucked. But we can say by the end of this decade, we are gonna do X. And I would love for our families and our educators to get together to figure out what is that X? What is this bold goal, this moonshot that we can accomplish by the end of this decade? For us, we would like for that to be targeted towards students who are designated as at risk and students with disabilities. So we do call on our school leadership, and many of them are here today, to put out a bold plan to meet those bold goals. And I'm going to turn it over to Bisi Oyedele, who is the managing partner at Education for DC. He has 2 children in DC public schools, and he will be facilitating our panel conversation this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. I should probably speak into this. Thank you, Josh, and the entire Empower K-12 team for this report and for organizing this conversation today. I've been tasked with facilitating a brief discussion with some pretty important figures in the DC education landscape to discuss the findings of this report. To the immediate left, we have Ms. Patricia Brantley, who's the CEO of Friendship Public Charter Schools. Her career in education began over 20 years ago, part of the founding team at Friendship, and prior to serving as CEO, she was the founding Chief Operating Officer of Friendship Public Schools. Deputy Mayor of Education Paul Kihn started in his role in 2018, October 2018. Prior to that was the Deputy Superintendent in Philadelphia Public Schools, and prior to that was also the education partner at McKinsey & Company. And we have Dr. Patricia Brantley, who's currently the acting State Superintendent of Education. Prior to joining us here, she was also at the District of Philadelphia Public Schools, excuse me, where she led the charter office as well. And prior to that, she was also the Deputy Executive Director of the New York City Department of Education. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you all taking the time to engage in this conversation. So the format will be me offering a few questions, asking the panelists to respond, and then we'll leave some time at the end for questions from the audience as well as from those who are attending online. And so the first question will be directed to you, Ms. Brantley, and we'll just go down the line here with folks responding. And it's a softball question to get things started, but as leaders who are deeply immersed in the issues related to academic recovery, I'm obligated to start with one of the observations that has been made even before data was available to quantify the impact that COVID-19 has had on unfinished learning. How do you all as leaders make sense of the fact that historically disenfranchised students struggled to make progress, especially in the areas that are arguably the most difficult to teach or support at home? Ms. Brantley.
So certainly, thank you for the question, VC, and not softball at all. I can't make sense of the nonsensical, right? It's difficult to make sense of tragedy, and it's hard to make sense of what we knew to be true going into the pandemic. We have students that are farthest from opportunity, students that don't have the requisite investment to help them catch up, and it didn't make sense to think that the pandemic was going to make that better. What we find, what I do try to make sense of is what we know from history, that we have to invest, plan, and act. And what we learned during the pandemic is that there were some schools that were able to make progress. And so we take what we know from history, that lack of stability and stress often experienced by our students that are farthest from opportunity has exacerbated the gaps. Those things only grew during the pandemic. But we learned that students that had more stability, internet access, the ability to come into a school, whether it was for direct instruction or in a learning hub where they were getting virtual, that those things increased their ability to be able to learn and to be able to access education. What I try to make sense of is how do we take all those lessons and leverage them now to ensure that students can learn in school stably, that they're in school every day, that we reduce quarantines and reasons for them to be out, but that we also make it true that if they do have to be out, they have the internet, they have the technology, they have access to master teachers that are virtual. That's what I try to make sense of today.
Thank you, Ms. Brantley. Paul?
Thanks, BC. Thanks for including me in this very important discussion, and thank you to Empower K-12 for another fabulous report that we'll all benefit from. I think in reflecting on your question, I think of Brian Stevenson's constant exhortation that all of us need to get proximate to the challenges that we are attempting to address, and that's certainly true for policymakers. And I feel like what the pandemic did is it reminded us of the depth of inequity that exists in our city, and we were able to get proximate to a problem as a city and as policymakers in a way that we were not able to prior. We were literally looking into countless student homes. We were deeply understanding that there are thousands of families that don't have access to basic resources like internet. We learned deeply about students who don't have the family and community supports equally spread across the city that we would want them to have. And as the geography of schooling shifted from school buildings into homes, I think it provided us with a number of critical lessons about resourcing that we will need to carry forward.
Thank you. Dr. Grant?
Thanks. I feel like we can't social distance. Josh, and just thank you so much for your warm reception since I've moved to DC and for allowing me to be here today, and everyone at Empower Ed. Thanks for holding space for this this conversation. I think it's important for us to always reflect on what's happened as we set a path for our future. And this alignment is not just by the construction of the panel. This is the type of alignment that we're going to need to make sense of today and make sense of what happens from all of the work that we're going to do to move forward. I too, like my fellow panelists, I don't know that any of us will ever make sense of over 700,000 lives lost. What started on March 12th was, we're just gonna go home for 2 weeks. It's gonna be okay. Unfortunately, one of my closest friends is an epidemiologist, and I called and he was like, it's not gonna be 2 weeks. He's like, empty your office. You're not coming back. This is the historical moment that everyone has talked about. And I think in that spirit, two things are true. If I were in school at the time of a global pandemic, and pretend internet existed, right? Pretend I'm young enough. Both my parents were essential workers, and I would have been home every day, arguably by myself, for 18 months. And I was a good kid. I loved school. What does that look like and sound like? And I think in Philadelphia, we saw that play out every single day. House catches on fire. Why is the house on fire? Because kids are at home by themselves, right? Child walks out the house, goes on a walking journey. Why did the child, so it's all the things we are not talking about and instructional learning and what took place. And so I don't know that we'll ever make sense, or I keep saying that, Harvard will write case studies, like what was the DC response to COVID and so all the case studies will come reflecting on the moment while we're living in the moment. And so I think in that spirit, I make sense of a lot of what Pat touched on. In 2021, every child in America should have access to high quality internet. Full stop. They also should have access to technology and infrastructure that allows them to learn wherever they need to learn. And then the part that I hope we get to is the way that we support, nurture, invest, in some ways rebuild our teachers to help them make sense of what happened to them as well. I think we come out of this realizing adults always said, well, students need school. If you go into a school today, you actually see children who at any age are like, no, I want school. This is the place I need to be. These people matter. A child was like, an 8th grader said, I was like, what do you need? And he said, do not close this school. I'll wear my mask. Well, I'll do all the things, but do not make us go home with them as in their parents, again. And I think as a community of educators, we have to invest in that moment that children see the value of the schoolhouse in a way that they did not see and appreciate in 2019. Kids are coming to school on time, culture is better. I'm walking into schools 2 months in, and they're like, no, they're not arguing with anybody, they're just happy to be here. And even when we have behavioral incidents, like Pat said, they're directly connected to things that took place during the pandemic that we haven't created an environment for the children to breathe and speak about. They lost grandma. Who's gonna help unpack that for them? A couple of things may not have gone well for them. So it's all of that work that I know we can make sense of as we navigate the days ahead. But I think this is a space where we actually can't battle with each other, because we didn't cause the purpose, we didn't cause coronavirus. So if we have to be aligned and work together as we make it make sense for our children. And I think that's gonna serve us well as we try to rebound, not just the academic growth for our children, but make them whole again.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. For the next question, we'll start with Paul. As you all and other educators across the city have been working harder than ever to address the challenges that COVID has exacerbated but did not necessarily create, I'm wondering if you all can take a moment to maybe reflect on some systemic and practitioner-based strategies that you all would point to as effective in aiding with the efforts to address unfinished learning this year.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question, BC. And I will start in a place that's not schooling related, but it's basically an exhortation and a reminder that the single biggest tool that we've got to mitigate ongoing loss of learning is the vaccine, and it is vaccination. And the primary strategy that all of us have right now to ensure a quicker end to this exacerbation of learning inequity is getting everybody vaccinated. If you are a close contact and you're asymptomatic and you're vaccinated, you do not have to quarantine. If you are vaccinated and you do happen to have a breakthrough case, you do not get very sick in general. And right now we have vaccination rates in DC which are good, but they are not at 100%. And the more that we can get our students and our communities and all of our adults educated, the sooner we will be out of the worst of this pandemic. And also, in the unvaccinated population, that's the place where variants grow. And so there's just a huge burden of responsibility on us right now to focus on getting everybody vaccinated. In addition to that, of course, as a city, and out of my office and working closely with Pat and Christina, we've developed a very comprehensive set of strategies to mitigate the loss of learning across the city. We've been working on these for over a year. They begin with getting schools reopened. And again, this report helped remind us the importance of in-person learning, but our primary strategy is to have school buildings that are safe and open, where students can be in with their teachers, and we've invested a lot of time and money, and all of the educators here have worked enormously hard on doing that. That's our primary strategy. Secondly, we've worked on re-engaging students. We've worked on ensuring students have the right mental health supports in school buildings. We've invested in expanding the opportunities for learning. And importantly, and I know Christina will talk about this, we've invested heavily in high-impact tutoring, and we're doing that in a number of different ways. We've ensured the supply amongst tutoring partners by pre-investing in them so they can build their capacity. We have taken tutoring to non-traditional locations because we've realized we have to go where students are when it's not in school. So we've put tutoring into DPR summer camps. We've put tutoring into summer youth employment work-based learning opportunities. We've put tutoring into out-of-school time organizations, and we've done it all over the city. In addition, we've made investments in our educators and our workforce, the single most important people, literally the heroes of the pandemic and the heroes of our system. We've invested there, and we've invested in family well-being, as families have shouldered more and more of a burden of responsibility.
Thank you. Paul mentioned something that's critically important, vaccination. And I have to agree, the response to improving or finishing learning, or the unfinished learning, much of it is not a school's response. It's a city and a community's response to things that have to happen outside of school so that students can leverage their time inside of school. And so, you know, I've often heard a quote that this is becoming the pandemic of the unvaccinated. If we believe that unfinished learning was sort of tragic during the height of the pandemic for everyone was out of school for a certain period of time. But right now, what we face in schools that have more students that are at risk is that in communities that are heavily at risk, there is much less vaccination of both adults and students. And that means that students that are at risk, now that we are coming back to school full time, have less time in school because they do have to quarantine, because they are out. And so I would say that the community response and the education needed to get people vaccinated has to ramp up right now, immediately. But we also have to think about other strategies that will allow students to remain in school in the stable environment. I don't know what all of those are, whether that's test to stay, more frequent testing, whatever it is, we must keep kids and adults in schools and learning, because we know that that's what helps the students who are most at risk. But what I would also say in terms of the investments that we need to think about is we have to invest in families and their stability, whether that's food, housing, vaccine education, as I've already said. Those are the things that allow students to be healthy and to come to school on time. Transportation. We saw our online school having significant growth, but parents in our online school are already trained to be learning coaches. What many families had to figure out sometimes on their own, but generally with school help last year. What are we going to do to make sure that families can support learning at any time and anywhere that their student wants to access it? Secondly, we have to resource teachers and their well-being. We need them to be in school and able to give, and they gave so much during the pandemic. Teachers are exhausted, school staffs are exhausted, and so their mental health and well-being has to also be something that we consider. But they also were able to learn as well. Teachers came back and said, I learned about how I could give better feedback when I had to do it through a computer screen, right? How to give kids assignments that they would do asynchronously. We can still do that, and we need to take advantage of it. We have to resource schools. And I know that there's already a lot of investments that are coming through, but without 100% stable internet for all of our families at home, computers at home for every child, and then transforming our curriculum in a way that if a student does have to quarantine, which as I've said is going to be much more likely for students that are at risk, that they are able to seamlessly continue to access learning.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, they stole all of my thunder. I'll attempt to add on. I will touch on the significant investments we're making on high-impact tutoring, not just because they are the right investments, but because I think if you all look back in your own educational journey, you will remember a moment where a tutor either helped you or would have been transformational in helping you bridge a gap. And the investment is significant. It's $41 million over the next 5 years. And as the deputy mayor referenced, it isn't just tutoring based inside of a school. And so we really are trying to think about which other agencies should stand up tutoring options, which community-based organizations should be trained on how to provide tutoring, and then actually have a base of individuals from community who will sit with children and tutor them. And here's the point that I want to stress with respect to tutoring. Tutoring is not all remediation. Tutoring is deeply understanding. When you think of your little one who comes home and shows you a math assignment, that even as adults, you're like, nope, we're not, I don't even know how to help you. Who is the person that child can have a relationship with that can say, can we go over this one more time? Can you give me feedback on my writing? This is what I specifically need to bridge the gap for my learning. It's the type of targeted support that really will do two things. One, accelerate learning or build on learning that has taken place. But more important, it will shift the mindset of a child around what is the purpose of learning and the relationship they should have with an adult about learning. So we can't come at this with children thinking that they did something wrong, and so they have to do this thing because they did something. Tutoring is this space that everyone in their educational journey will need support. And we have to shift the mindset of our young learners to understand that in ways that when we talk about privilege and access, those who have privilege, you hear them say it. Children go to school and then they see their tutor. Their tutor comes to the house on the weekend. They go, parents just are like, I have the money to pay for it. I'm gonna make sure my child has it. We are taking that language back and saying, we have the money to pay for it. We will make sure every child has the access. So I wanna frame why this investment in tutoring is so important. And in schools where you see it taking place, teachers are like, oh, I love it so much. I get to tutor my kids after school. Thank you so much for giving us resources because we want to be here. And it really helps change the dynamic, not just tutor to teacher, but learner to adult, helping them learn more. The second is one that Pat referenced that I really do want to make sure we talk about is how are we thinking about our educators, all educators, through the journey of recovery. Teachers, principals, even individuals sitting on this stage. All of us are recovering from something that none of us, there is no graduate course in education on global pandemic management. And so there has to be a safe space and environment that's grounded in wellness for us to process what took place, how we stay grounded in the work, and then how we reinvigorate ourselves to push forward. Because it's November, but in the life of an educator, it feels like June. And it's not June, it's November. And so we have to figure out How do we refuel ourselves? How do we reinvigorate ourselves? And then how do we turn that through our systems so folks stay in it? Because we're just building back our muscle. And if any of you work out, 6 months from now, we'll be back. But right now, we have to make sure folks don't give up as they're just trying to get their legs under them again. And I think we have to talk more about how we make sure educators are held in this time. Last year, at 7 o'clock every day, they would bang pots and pans for like cops and nurses. And I'm like, we need to do that for educators, because we're like back in, we're in the schools, we're on the ground. Like, there needs to be a community celebration to make sure folks know, educators, thank you. You are back in school. We kept the school doors open. Kids are happy to be there, but there needs to be a collective celebration to make sure people stay grounded in doing the work, because it's never been harder than it is now to serve in public education.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. And even as you say that, I'm going to ask a question that asks us to forecast a little bit. Obviously, not to gloss over the very real and present nature of the current circumstances, but I'm wondering, as you all look ahead to the next 2 years, what do you see as some necessary steps to potentially address some of the challenges from the last 2 years? And then what message would you all offer to educators and parents as well in light of those circumstances?
I'm going to be quick in this answer, I promise. I think over the next 2 years, we obviously are going to administer the statewide assessment this spring. It will give us a shared language of where our children are, and we have to be mindful about how we narrate that. The data is going to tell us where our children are. And then we will go through a process of continuing to align our investments to make sure that our children are back on track, but actually back better, and that DC continues to build on its historic level of gains across this system. And then I say that the next 2 years really are, how do we grow the things that we learned and that we know work? I ran a set of schools in Philadelphia that, because they were one-to-one schools, there was no difference in their learning environment when they went virtual. And all they wanted was access to their teachers once a week for advisory. And in some of those schools, their graduation rates increased. High schoolers were more engaged because they were like, oh, no, I know asynchronous learning. We've been doing this. So how do we grow models that we knew worked and met children where they are? And how do we bring parents and community back into the schoolhouse so that everybody has a shared understanding? Because I think what Pat said is 100% right. This is an because journey of building back. And so we need schools, we need community, we need parents. Everyone is going to have to be in this journey. Because I think we all came out of this knowing that school was important. And now we all, if you go to a school in the morning and you see a parent pushing their kid, they're like, get into the schoolhouse. It is the center of community, and our collective work together is what we're gonna have to do over the next 2 years to gain back the ground that was lost, but actually cultivate new ground, plant new seeds, and be in a dramatically different place 10 years from now.
Thank you. Let's go to Paul.
Thanks, BC. And being on this panel reminds me why I am so pleased to have leaders like Pat Brantley and Patricia Grant at the helm over the next 2 years to help us. You two have been extraordinary leaders during the pandemic, so thank you. And I would share my own thoughts about the next couple of years really revolve around 3 different areas of work. The first is, and I run the risk of repeating myself, the first is vaccination and health. And it's critical that over the next couple of years we get everybody vaccinated. This pandemic is not over. Everybody suspects in the science and health communities that there will be another increase over the winter months, and that the pandemic will become endemic, and we will be dealing with it on an ongoing basis for the rest of our generation. So we've got to get everybody vaccinated and ensure we've got the right kinds of layered mitigation strategies ongoing and sustained in schools over the next 2 years that will do the best to keep most students in and well. Alongside that, we've got to differentiate our instructional approach, which is embodied, I think, in this tutoring that we're all so obsessed with because it seems to be the evidence-based strategy that will work the best, and quite complicated. You have to understand deeply where students are. They've got to be in the right groups. You have to give the right dosage. There's got to be consistency with their daytime schoolwork. And so there's lots of work being done by City Tutor, for example, by OSSI and other partners to get it right. but we've got to get it right. And this will require investment and energy. And that brings me to my third point, which again will run the risk of repeating something we've talked about here, but we can't say it often enough. The next 2 years is really about our teachers and our teacher workforce. Because schools look different right now, and the job of teachers is different right now. And we've kind of bootstrapped a response in some elegant and in some inelegant ways, but we're certainly asking people in school buildings to do something different than they were doing 2 years ago. And we have to understand what that means, what it means for their workload, their morale, their expertise, and all these additional people that we've supplied into schools. We have to understand what they should be doing, and are they doing the right things, and the health protocols. Do we need teachers to be doing dismissal and greeting students, or is that something others should be doing? What's the right role for paraprofessionals and teacher aides in our schools? Because this is about sustaining the folks that matter the most and allowing them to continue to be deeply expert in the things they must be expert in. And we cannot overvalue that.
Thank you. My message to parents and students and people involved in education: have hope and hold on. The most difficult journeys often lead you to a better place. If we think about things that happened during the pandemic or the height of the pandemic, what we know is that there was learning that was happening. It's sometimes glossed over, but even in the Empower K-12 report, you'll see that DC, relative to the rest of the country, had less loss, right? We obviously have to think about where the gaps are, but there is something to be learned in what happened over the last 18 to 20 months. And for me, I think tutoring and the investment the city is making in tutoring and in schools is unprecedented, right? But it was an unprecedented pandemic. But that investment in tutoring is really about personalizing learning for each individual child. Well, the schools that did best over the last 18 to 20 months were able to do that by reaching into homes and seeing what each child needed and then trying to deliver to it. So what I hope we don't lose as we come out of the pandemic is an understanding that school isn't the building, that education can occur wherever kids are, and that is the way the world is going. You don't have to go into a grocery store to have groceries. You order it on an app. And all of our children, and all of our adults, most of our children are walking around with computing devices that will allow them to learn anywhere, anytime. And so my advice is, let us take what happened during the pandemic, let us pilot and resource and deepen and get kids learning wherever they are, whether it's through tutors that can work one-on-one, through apps, through programs, through online learning. But let's not lose what we did learn.
And so I think with that, we will take a few questions that Josh and his team have compiled from the live stream as well. Thank you, Kihn. So this might be a question for Josh. This comes from Jessica Giles. How many students in the study were untested?
Yeah, thanks, Jess Giles, for that question. We do mention it in the report. About 1 in every 8 students at the schools who participated in our study, those 1 in every 8 students were untested. We heard from a variety of reasons for instructionally and developmentally appropriate reasons they didn't take the assessment, or that it was very challenging to get them in the assessment window. But what we did find for the untested students is that they were more likely to have lower attendance rates and lower achievement rates pre-pandemic. And so it's likely, although not necessarily guaranteed, that the results that we present today are slightly better than normal. So thanks, Jess, for the question.
And then I think this question is for you also. And this comes from Catherine Bellinger. What % of at-risk students were represented in the study's scores?
Thanks, Catherine, for the question. First, DC students who are designated as at risk make up about half of the DC population. And in our study, we captured about 75% of those at-risk students who are in grades K through 2 are captured in our data. It's a little over half of the students who are designated at risk in upper elementary are captured in our data, and a little bit less than half at middle school.
Awesome. Are there any questions from the audience? We'll give
Guess
some
not,
wait-
BC.
Well, I was going to say we'll give some wait
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
but hearing no questions, then want to thank the panelists again for the time, for the excellent work that you all are doing, spearheading the recovery efforts from many perspectives, and for offering advice and guidance for those who are listening today. And I'll turn it back to you, Josh, to close us out.
Thanks, BC, and thanks, Pat, thanks, Paul, thanks, Christina. Appreciate you being here today and talking about what we're doing in the future. I want to close on a sort of optimistic note. We talked about making bold commitments for the future. Pre-pandemic in 2019, Empower K-12 has been honoring bold schools since 2016. These are schools whose students who are designated as at risk or have a growth or achievement that are on track to closing national opportunity gaps within a decade. And we had in 2019 a record number of bold schools that we honored pre-pandemic. So we know that this work is possible. These schools were on track within less than 5 years of closing national achievement gaps. But we do know that the challenge is daunting moving forward. But what are these schools doing? Like, some of it is not necessarily unknown, but what they're doing is doing a lot of work to blend that art of teaching with the science of education. They're using data to figure out what is working and what is not working in our classrooms in record time, right? They're not waiting until the end of the school year to have a conversation. They're waiting 2 weeks. And so we think, what is the art of teaching? Well, first off, that's connecting and inspiring with students. Our teachers do a great job of that, right? That's blending their interests with the content and the curriculum to make a real difference in the lives of those students. But we also know that at the bold schools, educators are really looking at a deep analysis of the root causes. Like, why are our students not learning as much as we want to? How are our small groups working? How is high impact tutoring working for each and every student? They're not waiting till the end of the quarter to assess that. They're assessing that bi-weekly. And what we think is possible if all of our schools were bold schools, that we could close the national achievement gap for our lowest income Black and brown learners by the end of this decade. Let's make this decade the last decade that our low income Black and brown students have opportunity gaps with their more affluent white students nationwide. Thank you everyone for attending online. The full report is available at empowerk12.org. This recording will be available on YouTube. We will also be posting it on our website and on Twitter. Thank you for coming today. Again, thank you for our panelists for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you for all of your hard work. To the educators in the classroom right now, I know you're probably not watching this. Thank you for everything that you're doing. It is making a difference. It really is. It's hard work. Please hang in there. We appreciate you. We will be supporting you as much as we can. Thank you. Take care. Everyone have a great day.